Now, let me introduce our very first session, our keynote speakers. We have Dr. Michael Salgaler from National Institute of Health from the US. I believe he's in Washington, DC. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes.
And we have Dr. Danny Sun from Singapore. He's with A*STAR, and we'll talk about what A*STAR does in the session. Then this session is going to be moderated by Dr. Toru Seo, Pfizer. He'll be interviewing the two gentlemen during this session. Now over to you, Dr. Seo.
Thank you very much, Hal. It's a nice introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, greeting from Nihonbashi, Tokyo. Good morning and good evening to everyone around the world. It is really a pleasure to be hosting or moderating the very first session, which I think is going to be really exciting. So as Hal said, we have Dr. Michael Salgaler and Dr. Danny Sun, both from NIH and A*STAR respectively. I can't think of any other person who are better suited for these sessions, as these two institutes have been extremely successful and has a successful track records of driving innovation. So we have 15 minutes today in the first session. So what I will do is to ask both Michael and Danny to give a 10 to 15 minutes presentation at first, and then we will spend the remaining time, maybe 20 minutes or so, to go over some of the key points that I think will be beneficial to everyone in terms of thinking about innovations. So I'm be moderating questionings, but also I might solicit questions from audience as well. So without further ado, welcome Michael, welcome Danny. Maybe we can get started with Michael.
Sure. Do you want me to, are you going to go through show the slides there, or should you share your screen?
If you could, please share it from your side, please.
Okay. Are you seeing my first slide?
Yes, we are.
Great. So thank you very much. I very much appreciate participating in this, this wonderful event. I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about the National Institutes of Health as a technology development and commercialization partner. So let's start at the beginning. This is our main campus, and we have several different parts of our mission. It's to attract new R&D resources. It's to do a lot of fundamental good science and generate intellectual property. We are funded by the US taxpayer, and so part of our mission is to obtain a return on public investment, use that to benefit public health. But a very key part of our mission is also to stimulate economic development within the US.
We lost the audio. Michael, are you still there? Danny, are you still online?
I'm here.
Okay. Michael?
I'm afraid we are having a network issue with Michael.
So maybe in that case, maybe we can get started while you're reconnecting to Michael. Maybe I can ask Danny to get started in the interest of time. Is that
Sure.
okay?
Let me try to see if I can project mine.
Shall we start with Danny?
Sure, give me a second. Let me. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. So Michael is having a little trouble with connecting, technical difficulties. So we'll get started with Dr. Danny Sun of A*STAR, and then we'll come back to Michael afterwards. So Danny, without further ado.
Right. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak on this morning's session. And what I'd like to do is just talk a little bit about the Singapore research funding scene just to begin with, and then maybe just some slides on how A*STAR works with industry, both small companies as well as larger companies and MNCs. So Singapore does research funding in 5-year tranches, and generally we commit about 1% of our GDP to research funding. So for this current tranche of funding on the top, if you see to the far right of this, the current tranche of RIE 2020, Singapore actually committed $19 billion. This is Singapore dollars for R&D efforts, and this is over 5 years, and it's spread out to ensure excellent science, to create greater national coordination of multi-stakeholder and multidisciplinary collaboration. We want to ensure responsiveness to pursue new opportunities and tech development. And importantly, we want to strengthen the flow from research to economic and societal impact. All right. And this is how we spread our dollars out. In this current 5-year tranche, we actually committed money towards research in advanced manufacturing and engineering, health and biomedical sciences, the services and digital economy, and also with urban solutions and sustainability. These are the vertical domains. But in order to make sure that we continue to support and resource the underpinning horizontals that support all of these, we also put funding towards academic research, manpower development, as well as towards innovation enterprise activities. This means the types of work that will turn good research into products. So if we were to look at Singapore over the last 15 years or so, in the early days, in the early 2000s, for the biomedical sciences, we did invest quite significantly in building up our academic and basic science capabilities. So this was in the first 5 to 8 years. And during this period, there was perhaps not yet enough mature technologies to spin off small biotech companies. During the early era also, there was effort from the Singapore government to actually engage the multinational companies. So in this space, we actually brought in quite a number of MNCs who set up research labs in Singapore in the biomedical sciences. Towards the latter part of the decade and the early parts of this decade, we were beginning to see a greater uptick of companies that were formed in the biomedical science spaces. So if you look at this box on the right, in 2018, for 6 months, we managed to raise in excess of US $300 million in deals and investments for Singapore biotechs. These are only the ones that we know about. All right. So I think in Singapore, we believe that we are starting to see the beginning of an indigenous biotech ecosystem, where there are companies that are taking IP from within and outside of Singapore, taking them forward in development towards either diagnostics or therapeutics. And I think this is an exciting time for Singapore with regards to the growth of the biotech ecosystem here. So how does A*STAR work with the local biotechs? A few things that we do to help support them. For instance, 2 companies here, Tessa and Lion, formed joint laboratories with the Institute of Molecular and Cell Biology. Both of these companies are in cell therapies for cancer. So in the case of Tessa, they had a joint lab for developing their immunotherapy drugs. For Lion, they use the Joint Lab to use gene editing technology, again, to enhance T-cell products. Another company, for instance, InVitroQ, who is in diagnostics, formed a joint lab with the Genome Institute of Singapore to develop their Onco platform to link phenotypic and genomic data to patient response. How else do we work with biotechs? Like, we do licensing and co-development. For instance, a company, Paracrine Therapeutics, actually develops exosomes. And in this case, it's like technology that's licensed out from the Biotechnology Institute, as well Bioprocessing Technology Institute, as well as the Institute for Medical Biology. In the case of Aslan, they licensed a series of therapeutic monoclonal antibodies. In the case of Tessa, they actually took out a bunch, half a dozen checkpoint inhibitors out of SIGN. Right, so this is one way that we support our local biotechs by creating good IP that we are able to license out for them to add to their portfolio. Last but not least, we're involved in startup incubation. For us, this is still early days. One of the divisions within A-Star called Accelerate runs a small incubator called A-Star Central. And this is a co-innovation space to incubate and support technopreneurs and build successful startups. So some examples of companies that have come through are like Tycon, which is a local company looking at therapeutic monoclonal antibodies. Engine Biosciences, which is a AI in drug discovery therapeutics company. This company actually came in from the US. Their IP is from MIT, but they bring it to Singapore to develop. Lucence is a local spin-off company from A-Star, and they're in molecular diagnostics, looking particularly in cancer liquid biopsy. So this is what modern Biopolis looks like. This is a map of the Biopolis area, and then adjacent to us, about half a kilometer away, is the JTC Launchpad. These are the buildings within Biopolis where you can see now co-location of our basic science research together with small biotechs. For instance, here in the Centros building where I'm located, there is the Bioprocessing Technology Institute, and located within just within the floors up and down from there is a joint lab with ESCO Esther, with Prestige Biopharma, which is a Korean, originated in Korea, but they built IP in Singapore. A company called Mesoblast. We're looking at exosomes. So there are, I would say, congregation of small companies around our bio institutes, leveraging the technologies that they offer. So this is the way that we feel we can help the growth of our local biotechs. So going on into perhaps supporting the larger companies, what do we do in this particular arena? One of the things that we do quite well at A-Star is the ability to put together large research consortia. So for example, this was a program that we put together over a period of about 2 years. It took a bit of time because the discussions were quite complicated. It's called the Pharma Innovation Program Singapore, PIPS. And in this particular program, what we did is that we approached 3 large pharma companies who have manufacturing activities in Singapore. So these are Pfizer, GSK, and MSD or Merck. And we sat down and we looked and asked, what sort of problems or what do you see for the future of small molecule manufacturing in Singapore, of small molecule manufacturing basically as an activity, what can be done better? So if you look below, this is the batch manufacturing paradigm of the current state, right? Where you have a standard laboratories and traditional batch plants. But looking into the future, technologies such as continuous manufacturing, improvements in biocatalysis, decontamination, things with regards to IIoT, things like with regards to control tower and automation are really important for higher efficiencies of operating manufacturing plants. So in this regard, what A-Star did together with the National University of Singapore was put together a research program in these areas to try, guided by the technology problem statements stated by the 3 companies here, And actually, we're going down with good specifics about how to address problems in each of these areas. So this is funded by the Singapore government with inputs and contribution from the pharma companies to ensure that going forwards, these are technologies that could be implemented within the plants in Singapore. So beyond that, these are some examples of how Singapore has worked with large companies. For instance, in Procter & Gamble, we started off with a master research agreement in 2013. So this is some time ago. But we established a 60 million joint research project fund, which funded more than 60 projects to date. And then because of the successes coming through this in the early days, actually P&G opened an innovation center in 2014, comprising $250 million in investments and over 500 FTEs. Another very exciting unit is the Chugai Pharma Body Research Center. This is, I believe, Chugai's largest R&D unit outside of Japan. And they expanded R&D investments in Singapore, a total commitment of nearly $500 million over a 9-year period. And this is one of the, I would say, a really top-notch antibody discovery and development unit in the world, right? Nestle, for example, also opened in 2013 an R&D center in Singapore. Then they developed a food science and nutrition office with more than $9 million of collaborative projects with A-Star. And then in 2016, they opened a research center also. So in Biopolis. So Nestle has been a big player in our food and nutrition scene for a long time. They make a lot of products in Singapore, but now also with regards to R&D, they're contributing a lot of, I would say, activity. Right. So I think basically my prior slide already spoke to a little bit about how we manage our R&D collaborations. We can have, for instance, working with companies like Chugai, where they do their own in-house research based in Singapore. There's an integrated model where, for instance, the Merck Sharp and Dohme Translational Medicine Research Hub actually engages significantly with the local scene to do things like target discovery, biomarkers, and clinical trials. And then we can also do consortium or collaboration models, right? So this is some of the collaboration models we have with, I would say, the pharma companies. So without further ado, I think basically I've given you a bit of an overview of the different models by which A-Star works with small biotechs through research collaborations, through licensing of IP, joint labs, incubation, and then with the pharma companies, again, with several models, either one-to-one or in large consortia. We have the ability to work across different modalities. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. A fantastic presentation. I think now we have Michael back online, so maybe we can continue with Michael.
Yes, I'm sorry, I do not know how I got separated. Can you let me know which slide that I wasn't aware, with apologies, that there was a disconnection. Can you let me?
So up to second slide. So you may as well start from the beginning.
Okay. All right.
Danny, if you could unshare your slide, please.
Unshare, yes. Okay. Am I off the screen?
No. You're still with us. Thank you. Yes, we're okay. Thank you, Danny.
Okay. Again, many apologies. So can you see my my first slide?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so I'm sorry. So I'm going to go over in about 10 minutes how NIH works with companies around the world for technology development and commercialization. So our main campus is shown here, and our mission statement is elucidated on this slide. We are publicly funded, so part of our mandate is to obtain a return on the public dollar and to benefit public health. to take our technologies and prosecute intellectual property as is appropriate. And importantly, part of our mission statement is also to stimulate economic development. And that's what I'm going to center on with my comments today. There's a number of misconceptions about working with the NIH. One is that we only do basic research. Now, we do a majority of basic research, but we also have translational data and assets that do have some preclinical proof of concept, and we do have some clinical assets as well. We're thought of as the largest academic research center in the world. We publish a lot of papers. We award about 35 billion US dollars around the world for academic research, but that's not all we do. Actually, at any one time, we have hundreds of industry partnerships underway to do technology development and commercialization. It's thought that we don't award exclusive licenses, which of course for companies is very important, and we do. That can be negotiated. Because we're a large 20,000 person government organization, it's thought sometimes we're cumbersome and slow. And actually, we have a huge staff. They're very good at executing transactions, and so it's actually can be quite a rapid process. And the ideas don't have to just come from NIH. All the time, companies come to us with their ideas that they would like to further develop. And I've got an example of that in one of my slides. So we are the National Institutes of Health. There are 27 institutes and centers. The larger ones, such as the National Cancer Institute, shown in orange, oversee the intellectual property and the agreements for smaller centers that outsource their tech transfer needs to the larger ones. So for example, our office in orange also covers agreements, collaborations, and intellectual property for several smaller institutes and centers that represent strong market opportunities. Going left to right, for example, aging, such as Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, minority health, integrative health, child health, such as autism, the National Eye Institute, such as macular degeneration, and the National Institute of Drug Abuse, which would look into things like cannabis-based therapeutics and opioid alternatives. Now, if your company is focused on an area of a disease or disorder shown in white, such as stroke or kidney disease, well, you can reach out to us anyway, and we will provide you a referral to the relevant tech transfer office so that you have a point of contact to start discussions. We have a lot of therapeutics, but we also help develop and collaborate on devices, diagnostics, biomarkers, imaging agents. We do some in wearables and digital health. For those, we don't have a huge number of biomedical and electrical engineers. So more often than not, the company will bring in the technology for further development. It does not arise within NIH. We have vaccine tools and software at different stages. And we have lots of research tools such as animals, antibodies, other types of reagents that are available to companies just at cost on a non-exclusive licensing basis. So I'm describing licensing from and collaborating with our own internal faculty. This is not a special program, so there's nothing to apply for. It's not competitive. There's no page limits and margin limits. You get started just by letting us know you're interested, by meeting with us, or it can be done virtually by email and phone. And then we help identify what you're interested in doing with us. And then if it's licensing, we help identify assets. If it's a collaboration, we try to identify an internal thought leader interested in working with you. We have many different types of agreements to fit different company needs. Those address technology and knowledge gaps in a company's pipeline, or it could enhance the pipeline. You don't have to know which agreement is best for you. We do a needs assessment and help you find the agreement that works best for you. What do we provide on our side? Well, we can contribute technology. We have a lot of thought leaders, and we can also provide reagents, tools. We can also bring in manufacturing and regulatory input if wanted. What do we get from the companies? What does the company put in? Well, they can bring in technology, and their expertise can be technical and also can be how to do the commercialization development. We're not strong in how to bring products to market from the bench, and so we look on our company partners to do that. It's also a way, collaborations are a way that we are allowed to bring in additional funding to supplement our research budget. Now, if you collaborate and create new intellectual property with us, although it is co-owned, you get the right of first refusal to an exclusive license. So no one else gets a crack at it unless you turn it down. A fundamental important question for companies, of course, is who pays for what? And the answer is, it depends. It truly is on a case-by-case basis. It's negotiated up front so that you know sooner rather than later if it makes sense for you. Most arrangements are some form of cost sharing where both sides are contributing support. So the part of the support that we are providing to the collaboration is the indirect or in-kind support. An example is shown here. This is a company called Somnology. I like this example because it's a device which we're not known for as much as therapeutics. And it's an example of an industry bringing a technology to us. So they had a wearable sleep monitoring device that allowed patients with sleep disorders to be studied in the comfort of their own home. They didn't have to go to a strange sleep center and a strange room and get hooked up by a stranger with wires. But what they needed was, they needed clinical validation of their device. They had shown it could work in normal volunteers, but they were having a challenge getting that next round of risk capital because they didn't have any data that it would work in patients with sleep disorders. And so we met them at a conference. We had a couple phone calls to determine what they wanted to do with us. And we were able to identify a clinician interested in collaborating with them. And within 3 months, the research agreement was negotiated and executed. Getting back to the indirect or cost sharing, what the company provided, the company paid for the manufacture of 10 new devices specifically for the clinical trial. However, once they sent the device to us, we are covering the clinical trial costs. That will come to over $100,000. So we are not awarding the company $100,000. It's not a direct grant, but we are spending $100,000 on their behalf. That's the indirect or in-kind support. So for Somnology, that's $100,000 less they have to raise or account for in their burn rate. And then they'll get the data and they'll have clinical validation that they can use to raise their next round of funding. Working with us has significant commercialization and profit potential. Kite was a small immunotherapy company when it was formed about 5 or 6 years ago, largely around our assets. It grew to late clinical stage where it was acquired by Gilead for $11 billion US. If you look at the remainder of the slide, you'll see examples of products of different disorders and diseases that were either directly licensed from NIH or developed and taken to market in collaboration with NIH. And as you can see, there are some very healthy 2018 worldwide sales. Actually, if you add up all the product sales from in 2018 from products that were either licensed from us or developed with us and then licensed, it actually comes to about $1 billion US. We also have strong financial incentives for you to work with us. And one of the keys, if your company is private and still holding equity, is that we are not permitted to take equity. We take 0% of your company. And so for you, your current and your future investors, that's a major point, at least in the US. If you have a major research institute they will want somewhere between 8 and 20% of your company for an exclusive license. 0 certainly is much more favorable for your company. We have a very low overhead rate, which is the surcharge that research institutes put on a company to pay for things like the electricity and the heat. It doesn't go to the work itself. Again, in the US, the major research institutes have about 60% and up overhead rate. Because we are funded by the US taxpayer, ours is only 10%. So if your company does need to enter into a cost sharing relationship, at least you know that 90 cents of every dollar is actually going to move the product towards commercialization. When Somnology brought in their intellectual property for further development, their IP stayed theirs. We provide indirect or in-kind support for a lot of the relationships, and it's an opportunity to either have preclinical or clinical validation of your technology while working with world-renowned researchers and top resources. Now, again, this is an intellectual exchange. We're not a contract research organization. We want an intellectual exchange to help you further develop your product. And for us, we get to work with some really cutting-edge disruptive ideas. And for you, you get the prestige factor and the high profile being affiliated with the National Institutes of Health. And in fact, we're already doing about 20% of our agreements in Asia. We'd like to increase that. We're doing about 40% of our agreements with for-profit companies. We'd like to increase that. We work with companies, both large established and SMEs. They can be located, again, anywhere in the world. They do not have to be in the US. They do not have to have any operations in the US. We work with investors who are looking to start new companies or bolster the pipelines of their existing companies. We work with entrepreneurs who are looking for disruptive assets to be the focus of their next company. We work with technology scouts who are looking for assets, usually for large pharma projects and companies. And we work with economic development entities to grow the jobs and size of companies in their region. For example, we had a webinar several months ago with Jetro in Japan and Japan Bio. So I have provided the organizers with a copy of my presentation. So they have that. I would be happy to provide it for you if you contact me as well, but the organizers have that too. We can look into working together if we meet at conferences. We're typically at JP Morgan in January in San Francisco and at the Bio International Meeting. And we'd love to host a webinar if you have a group that would like to learn more about working with us. And we also host trade missions of companies who come to this country. And with that, I'll conclude my comments. And thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you very much, Michael. So again, it's another fantastic presentation. So you both presented the sort of details and value propositions, and I kind of see how you have been very successful using this scheme. So I will come back to that later on because I think it's very important. But maybe just I can get started with some general questions. You know, obviously, there are many institutes around the world, that provides a similar service or services, whether the grant or the investments through the collaborations, startup support, et cetera, et cetera. So you have mentioned that, why you excel in certain areas, but can you give me sort of a quick view how you have been successful doing that relative to others? Obviously, you don't have to compare with the A*STAR or you don't have to compare with the NIH, but in general around the world.
Right, so briefly, I mean, our mission is to improve global health, and that ends up, to be honest, with some more company-friendly terms for the industry partners that we work with. At least in the US, the technology transfer offices of major universities and research institutes are housed within the finance area. So they are seen as a revenue driver. So therefore, they are there to maximize revenues, maximize the percent royalty on sales, maximize each milestone payment. What we're trying to do is what our government calls fair value for the public dollar. Translated, that means that it tends to be less burdensome financially for companies. We also tend to backload financial agreements. And of course, if you're a small or medium company, you want the bill pushed downstream as much as possible. So those are some of the ways that we feel that we're highly competitive with the other major research centers.
Danny, any insights?
Sure. So I think obviously if you compare the US with Singapore, there's maybe 2 orders of magnitude difference in size, right? But we do, in terms of Singapore, try to leverage on some of our advantages. First and foremost, over a period of nearly 2 decades, with regards to biomedical science excellence, we have built up, I think, a number of institutes that have got excellent science. So that's really underpins what we then can bring forward towards industrial collaboration. The other thing that we do try to do in Singapore is try to ensure, and we're building from if you look back 2 decades, from a pretty low base with regards to capabilities in translational sciences. We do have in A*STAR, for instance, we operate a drug development unit, which is responsible for taking assets, through from a very early validated drug target through to a clinical trial, for example. So these are capabilities that we built out throughout the ecosystem in Singapore. And last but not least, I think in the last 5 years or so, I think the considerations around, and I showed you a bit earlier about how our biotechs have begun to sort of really take root here, is the greater ecosystem ability through capital, through the availability of incubation, and people, talent who understand the drill for taking good technology and turning it into a product. So those are, for Singapore, we understand what needs to be done. I think for us is building up that capability. So in the meantime, through our tech transfer offices, in A*STAR is through Accelerate. We do try to take technologies out to the company so that it can be taken forward. So fundamentally, it is about identifying the gaps. If you would ask me about what's competitive in Singapore, making sure that we identify it and then be very deliberate about building the capabilities to try and address it. Last but not least, I think with our position in the Asia Pacific region, what can we offer companies? In some way, we've had companies do come to Singapore and work with A*STAR from the West, who have an interest in accessing the Asian markets. So, from Singapore, a 6-hour flight takes you all the way out through to the majority of India, as well as most of China and Japan. So I think our location here, hopefully as a global city, enables companies to come here and hopefully set up a base here to access Asia.
Thank you. So let me just ask another general questions before I get into more detailed questions in details. Obviously, you have a lot of schemes, as you have nicely presented, but you are also one of the biggest institutional investors in your countries and perhaps around the globe. So what is the contributions of your investment over other schemes? The reason I'm asking this one is because obviously investment is a quite different scheme from, for example, the grants or the in-kind, collaborations, for example, to provide the technologies or any proprietary technology that is needed to drive, innovations in life sciences. The innovation is purely, primarily the business. So in your view, and also in the next 5 to 10 years, what do you think the investment scheme in your in your institute compared to other schemes will be impactful in terms of a percentage? Maybe start with Michael.
So, I'd have to use invest investment with a small I because, again, we're not, we're prohibited from a number of activities like, we can't put in equity and we can't sit on boards and we don't really, we're prohibited from playing any kind of an active role either with an established company or a new co. But as far as, the investment, we are provided funds from the US taxpayer, and from that we are expected to impact global health. And so to do that also with an eye towards the market, but the market does not have to be significant for us to, let's just say, invest in it. So we actually do provide a lot of support for technologies that are rare, orphan, and neglected, and therefore have a particular marketing challenge. We also help support trials that are prophylactic, which understandably companies do not want to undergo that kind of risk because of the huge timelines involved. And we help largely support the development of Gardasil, the first prophylactic cancer vaccine. And Merck eventually licensed it, but that was when it was well into the clinical trial, because of course in cancer, clinical trials take a long time if they are therapeutic. They take more than 10 years to demonstrate that you've prevented the onset of a disease. And we can also work with companies that are interested in developing treatments that have a very small patient population. And we work with nonprofit companies that are just trying to address a significant unmet need, especially in a pediatric population. So it's a little bit different, I know, about the I in investment, but looking at that as a global health contributor, we actually create a lot of opportunities for companies that otherwise would not get any interest or very much interest from the traditional investment communities.
Thank you. Danny?
Sure. So A*STAR primarily is a research organization. Although we are one orientated towards industry outcomes. So our role with regards to direct investments is actually quite small. So I think pretty much like what Michael is saying, the majority of support does come from the standpoint of research excellence, building of good technologies that we can take forward and partner with companies. And maybe just right at the tail end of that, when we are beginning to take technologies out in licenses to our own startups, we may provide small amount of grant funding to get them launched. And we take a small amount of equity in some companies, right at the very start, which they can acquire back at a later state. But the fundamental dollars with regards to what A*STAR can do in terms of actually investing in a company, we don't have that kind of mechanism. Something that we do doing a bit more in the last couple of years is looking out actively together with some of our partner agencies in Singapore to bring venture capital to Singapore, right? So I would say that we've seen a good flow of venture capital firms from the US, from Europe, from Asia, come to talk to us in the last couple of years, as I mentioned. And from our end, what we do is to provide them a look with some of our more mature technologies and just to give them a sense of what the flows could be like with regards to tech. And where appropriate, we might help or work together with our other agencies like the Economic Development Board or our what we call a sovereign fund, Temasek investments, to structure some kind of deals with the venture capital set up in Singapore. So those are things that we are pursuing presently.
Thank you. So we have a little more than 5 minutes, so maybe I can solicit questions from audience if any of you have any questions. Okay, while you are thinking, let me get to the more questions. So both of you presented some unique features of your institute. And maybe I can start with the Michael. And then maybe refer back to Danny as well. So the two key features that you mentioned, which I thought was very interesting, was of course you're not interested in equity, which kind of makes sense being in the public domains or that paid by taxpayers. So how do you make money out of this? I mean, I guess that's the very strict questions. And the second question I will have is about the first refusal right, which I thought was also very unique. And I'm going to refer back to Danny as well, whether you have similar structures like this. But how effective is this in terms of working with your partners, having, I'm not going to take your equity, I'm not going to take the first refusal right, but I will take this. Do you have any fixed scenario like that, Michael?
Well, we do. I mean, we do take like execution fees and milestone payments and royalties on sales, much like any other academic or research institute. Again, because we're not seen as a revenue driver, we typically have a little bit more favorable terms. So how do we make money? Well, we do a lot of activity. As you can see, from $1 billion total in product sales in 2018. Last year, just the National Cancer Institute, we took in $80 million in royalties on sales. So and that money, by the way, goes back into every institute's budget to increase their research budgets. So we are not permitted, our faculty, unlike most other research centers, are not permitted to be entrepreneurial. They cannot start companies. So, and they can't, again, they're very limited in the activity they can have with companies. So if they come up with an innovation that is funded by the taxpayer, that idea will literally sit on a shelf unless it gets an industry partner. So they can't just say, you know what, this is great, I'm going to start my own company and start developing it. They're not permitted to do that. So that is why we have these financial incentives to get companies interested in working with us. And again, because we have a different mandate, we're not under an economic development ministry. We're under a public health ministry that we sort of have a different mission. The reason that my group, for example, focuses on the numbers and the financial component is, although I'm a recovering scientist, as they say, I spent 20 years on the buy side, including in venture capital and in small companies. So I know that there has to be compelling financial reasons for somebody to work with us. The name and the logo is good, but it's not sufficient. So we have these other buy-side incentives to have companies consider us where they otherwise might not.
Danny, do you have anything with the first refusal? I know you take equity, but do you have anything with the first refusal right similar to NIH?
So that's a question I think I have to defer to my colleagues within the Tech Transfer Office to answer that specifically. So I'm not at this point, I think, could be very specific about that aspect of it. But I mean, maybe I could just expand a little bit on what Michael said. Well, with regards to A-Star, certainly we're a little bit more downstream because our mission is pretty much economic development and I would say innovation and enterprise, right? So we do allow our investigators to, with good technologies, to spin off companies. In fact, many have done so. There are terms by which we go about that. Then with regards to, I'll say, some of the company related measures, certainly we are allowed to take dollars from companies. We do some things on a fee-for-service basis. So the industry dollars do feature as one of our KPIs, although I would say very significantly. Again, A-Star is a research organization. The bulk of our funding comes in through grants. for building research capabilities and technologies. Some of it to then support translational activities. And then at the back end of it, we do have some tracking indicators. I think Michael showed some of it with regards to revenues generated from products that have been licensed out of the NIH. Similarly, we have some tracking measures both on the biomedical as well as the engineering side as to what technologies have been put into companies. And as far as possible, if we can track downstream how the companies have benefited with regards to expanding their operations or generating revenue, we do that also.
Okay, thank you. So I guess we are out of time. It was a I think we learned a lot, and I think I wish you the best and a more prosperous futures for both A-STARS and NIH. Again, thank you very much for joining. Good day and good evening.
Thank you. Thank you for having us participate.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, and please, would you give a hand in the room for Dr. Seo, for Danny, and for Michael? So thank you very much for a great start to the day. You set the bar very high, Dr. Seo, so thank you.